We're delighted to have him here. It's someone many of us have known, shared friendship with, and certainly read and been educated by for a number of years. He holds Princeton's celebrated McCormick Chair in Jurisprudence, which, as Judge Starr reminded us at dinner, was first held by Woodrow Wilson. He's also the founding director of the J. Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions, and of particular importance for the topic he will address tonight, he's chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, served on the President's Council of Bioethics as a presidential appointee in the United States Commission on Civil Rights, any number of other national appointments. He also has published more than a half dozen books, scores of articles, Yale Law Review, Columbia Law Review, Review of Politics, Review of Metaphysics, and numerous regular pieces exercising his role as a public intellectual in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, First Things, and other common periodicals and newspapers. He's received teaching awards from Princeton's Department of Politics and has given, it says here, honorific lectures at Harvard, Yale, University of St. Andrews, Cornell, and I'd like to scribble in there now, Baylor University. Member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and holds numerous honorary doctorates, degrees from Swarthmore and Harvard, and also from Oxford. Real honor to have him here. We had last year Terry Teachout, and Robbie said earlier that it was not fair that we forced him to follow Terry Teachout, the drama critic from the Wall Street Journal. There is a connection. Robbie is a very well known for his late night playing of the banjo and the guitar. And does Terry know about that? Maybe he needs to do a piece. Terry needs to do a piece on your musical performances. The last thing I'll say is that Robbie he's seemingly everywhere in our intellectual and public life. I was flipping around on the TV a month or so ago, and on C-SPAN had a very well-attended session that he and Cornell West were engaged in. He co-teaches a class with Cornell at Princeton where they were talking about the aims of the intellectual life and public discourse and the pursuit of truth, even with and especially with those with whom you might disagree. He's really an exemplary scholar, human being, and you're going to find out tonight what our students found out after they spent 2.5 hours with him this afternoon. They're all napping now. He's here. That he is an indefatigable conversation partner. Please join me in welcoming Professor Robert George.
Thank you very much, Dean Hibbs. That was a very generous introduction, and I'm grateful for it. And I'm very honored to be here at Baylor. I did try 10 years ago to come down. Something intervened and the details were provided by the dean. But it's a very special honor and privilege to be giving the 2015 Laura Blanche Jackson Memorial Lecture here at Baylor, and to be doing so in the presence of her beloved parents who have been such gifts to this university. Of course, I did not know Laura, but I have read about Laura. And as I was saying to our group at dinner earlier, her life, her short life, too short life, is just a tribute to what a single person, even in a short lifetime, can accomplish. The fact that she touched so many lives so positively, the fact that she was able to realize so many good things, her own ideals, faith and her humanitarianism, is just inspiring. And we should all be inspired by it. So to her parents and to her family and to the friends who knew her so well, I want to say thank you for this lecture and for the honor of giving it. It's also such a pleasure to be at a university led by Ken and Alice Starr. I met Judge Starr. I counted up on my fingers. Alice saw me. I'm not a mathematician. I have to use fingers. It took toes and everything else to get to 28 years that I have known the Starrs and admired them and loved them. And so it's really great to come down here where he is the man in charge, and I know he's doing a wonderful job. And part of why I'm so happy that Ken is at the helm is that Ken's deeply committed to the value that I'm here to talk with you tonight about, the value of religious freedom. And he is helping, along with so many of the rest of you, to make Baylor an institution that is going to make an important intellectual contribution to the defense of religious freedom. And I want to congratulate this university, and I want to congratulate the Wilsons on establishing the chair that's occupied by a great hero of religious freedom, Frank Wolf. In fact, if I can share with Laura tonight, I'd like to sort of dedicate my remarks to Congressman Wolf, who can't be here with us this evening, but who has assumed the chair that the Wilsons have endowed. Congressman Wolf was the United States Congress's great champion of religious liberty for his entire time serving his district in Virginia in the House of Representatives. He was the father of the International Religious Freedom Act, which I'll say a little bit about this evening. He was the champion, and not just in theory. He exemplified not only moral courage, but raw physical courage in going to places like Afghanistan and Iraq and Nigeria and the Central African Republic to actually try to understand what was going on for people on the ground in those places. And that great humanitarian spirit of his enabled him to muster the courage to do those things. Well, this is my first visit to Baylor. I've been wondering, Dean Hibbs, why all my Catholic friends have been moving down here. One from as far away as Scotland to join the faculty of a Baptist institution. So I'm glad to have the opportunity to come down, look around, and see for myself, and it is pretty darn impressive. I sort of wondered a little bit how Baylor beat out, Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Notre Dame, to attract the great philosopher John Haldane, one of the great philosophers of our time, who's just joining your faculty now. But I get it now. I see why someone of the stature of Professor Haldane would come down to Baylor. There's good stuff happening here, good intellectual stuff happening here. And this is a university that really aspires to be a Christian university in the very highest sense. Dean Hibbs kindly mentioned my service as chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And although I'm not this evening speaking on behalf of my commission, my remarks will certainly reflect my experience as a commissioner and now as chairman. So let me begin in a philosophical spirit by asking and proposing an answer to the question, why should we honor religious freedom and seek to uphold and protect it? I'll then focus on the tragically dire situation for religious liberty in so many places across the globe today. My charge is to speak to you on the state of religious freedom in the world. The condition is bad. The patient is in very bad shape, and we've got to do something about it. I'll say why. And then finally, I'll emphasize that our nation can and must do a better job than we have been doing in defending religious freedom. So why should we honor religious freedom? Why should we promote and defend it abroad, no less than honor it at home? And why should that be such a high priority? The way some people see it, those of you who've had introductory political theory classes will recognize this. As some people see it, the reason for respecting religious freedom is purely instrumental and ultimately self-interested. If you and I disagree in matters of faith, I should tolerate your beliefs and your religious practices so that you will tolerate mine. We make a deal. Religious freedom in this view is not so much a moral or human right as it is the product of a social contract. It's a kind of mutual non-aggression pact. Now, it's easy to see the appeal, the attraction of this view and explain why so many people think that's the whole story. A world in which members of each community live in fear that members of another will seize power and oppress them is hardly an ideal state of affairs. But that, of course, is what happens when there is little or no protection for religious freedom. Everyone fears what will happen to members of his own group and to he himself, and so each group agrees to tolerate the other so that it too will be tolerated. But there are some problems with this view. The one that's relevant to our deliberations this evening is that it ignores the fact that at its core, religious freedom means something deeper and much more profound than people, however grudgingly, tolerating each other in a kind of modus vivendi. Simply stated, religious freedom means nothing less than the right to be who we truly are as human beings. The fact is that we as human beings are drawn to ponder life's deepest questions, the questions of meaning, value, purpose. And we're driven really, to seek meaningful, truthful answers. Where do we come from? What is our destiny? Is there a transcendent, more than merely human, source of meaning and value? Is there a higher law, a law above the positive law of the state, that pulls us above personal self-interest in order to do unto others as we would have them do unto us? Now, no matter how any particular individual answers these questions, one thing is indisputable. As human beings, we can't stop asking them, and we would be diminished precisely as human beings if we were to try to lay them aside. This is one problem with much of secular higher education. It's a problem you don't have at Baylor. But one of the problems is we try to lay aside the great existential questions. We just want to ask, how do things work? And lay aside questions of what do they mean? What is their point? What is their value? So this suggests, if I'm right, that the religious quest is a constitutive part of our humanity. Our efforts to understand the truth and to live authentically and with integrity in line with our best conscientious judgments of truth are aspects of our flourishing as the kind of creatures we are, namely rational, intelligent, and free actors. And this in turn suggests that we must cherish and honor, preserve and protect the right of persons to ask and answer these questions as best they can, and within broad limits, to lead their lives with authenticity and integrity in line with their best judgments of conscience. And so both as individuals and together with others in communities of faith, religious freedom means the right to ponder life's origins, meaning, and purpose, to explore the deep questions about human nature, dignity, and destiny, to decide what is to be believed and what's not to be believed, and within the limits of justice for all, to comply with what one conscientiously judges to be one's obligations, openly, peacefully, and without fear. The great English theologian and man of letters, John Henry Newman, once observed that conscience has rights because it has duties. We honor the rights of conscience in matters of faith because people must be free to lead lives of authenticity and integrity by fulfilling what they believe to be their solemn religious obligations. But authenticity and integrity are directly threatened whenever there is coercion or compulsion in matters of faith or belief. Indeed, coercion doesn't produce genuine conviction, but merely pretense and inauthenticity. If you study oppression anywhere, the old Soviet Union, Mao Zedong's China, or even contemporary China, or North Korea, or Vietnam, or the Central African Republic, or, alas, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. Wherever you find oppression, you find conformity, yes, under threats, except for the few who can stand up and face the consequences, which will sometimes be martyrdom. You'll find conformity, but you won't find genuine conviction or authenticity. So, as the Quran says, there can be no compulsion in religion. Compulsion may cause a person to manifest outward signs of belief or unbelief, going to church or not going to church, or outward signs of belief or atheism, but it can't produce the interior acts of intellect and will that constitute genuine faith. It's not just that faith shouldn't be coerced. It can't be coerced. Outward behavior, yes, you can force someone to not go to church or lose his job, or to go to church on pain of some punishment if he doesn't go to church. But that's not genuine faith. Those outward acts are distinct from the inward acts of intellect and will, which, when we have authenticity, are manifested in outward acts. Therefore, it's essential that freedom of religion include the right to hold any belief or none, to change one's beliefs and religious affiliations, a very big issue in many countries in the world today. I'll talk more about it. To bear witness to one's faith in public and not just in private. That's an issue in our own country. And to give expression to one's faith corporately as well as individually. That is, as religious communities and not just as individuals. And then to act on one's religiously inspired convictions about justice and the common good, as Martin Luther King, for example, did in carrying out the duties of citizenship. True religious freedom is not consistent with the idea that religion is a purely private matter and it's got to be kept in the closet. You hear people say things like that. We shouldn't have religion in the public square. But these same people will praise Dr. Martin Luther King, whose entire witness was a public witness rooted in his Christian faith. What an irony. And it's vital that religious liberty's full protections be extended to those whose answers to life's deepest questions reject belief in the transcendent. Unbelievers have a right to religious freedom too. Now, because the right to religious freedom is so central to human personhood, to our very being as humans, thus to the dignity of human persons, we would expect that in places where it is dishonored, societies would be less secure, less content, less peaceful. And according to a growing number of studies, that is precisely the case across the world. These studies show that countries that protect religious liberty tend to be more secure and stable than those that don't, and that nations that tramp on this freedom provide fertile ground for war and poverty, terror, and radical movements. In other words, not only do religious freedom abuses violate the core of our humanity, they do grave harm to the order and well-being of societies. They do so politically, as religious freedom abuses are highly correlated with the absence of democracy and the presence of other human rights abuses. They do so economically, as religious persecution destabilizes communities and marginalizes the persecuted, causing their talents and abilities to go unrealized, robbing a nation of added productivity and reducing that nation's ability to fight poverty and create abundance for its citizens. They do so morally, since wherever religious freedom is dishonored, the benefit of religion in molding character is diminished, and with it the self-discipline necessary to handle the rights and responsibilities of citizenship. And finally, they do so socially, since wherever religious freedom is abused, peace and security become ever more elusive. For the United States, all of this has a direct bearing on our own security. For example, of the 4 countries that hosted Osama bin Laden during his notorious life, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and Pakistan, each is an incubator of terrorism in the form of violent religious extremism. All of those countries have perpetrated or tolerated systematic and egregious forms of religious persecution. And as we all know, the 9/11 attackers plotted their attacks in Afghanistan, which was run by the Taliban, which originated in Pakistan, with 15 of the 19 terrorists from Saudi Arabia. Clearly, religious freedom matters. But sadly, according to the Pew Foundation, whose sociological work concerning the state of religious freedom across the globe is the gold standard in the field, I'm pointing at my friend Byron Johnson, who has worked with them and knows the work very well. Nearly 75% of the people of the world, they give the figure 74%. One can't be too precise in these matters, but it's a pretty reliable figure, I'm afraid. Something approaching very near 3/4 of the world's people. More than 5 billion human beings live in countries with governments that seriously violate or significantly restrict the right to religious freedom. Such restrictions range from burdensome rules on building houses of worship to detention and imprisonment, torture, and murder. All of these abuses violate not just American standards of religious freedom, but international human rights standards as well, human rights standards contained in covenants, treaties that many of the worst abusing nations have signed on to. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article 18 states that, and I quote, "Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom, whether alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance," unquote. You can't do better than that. The architects of the 48 Declaration got it exactly right. And so many nations that signed on and continue to claim that they are in good standing under the Charter systematically violate everything it says. Since 1966, the governments of 167 countries have signed the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, a binding treaty with protections very similar to Article 18. And regional bodies such as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Council of Europe, the Organization of American States also confirm religious freedom as a fundamental liberty. Now, as an independent, bipartisan U.S. government body, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom is firmly committed to the human rights standards found in these documents. As a key part of its mandate, our commission monitors religious freedom worldwide and makes recommendations to the President, the Secretary of State, and the Congress. Based on our monitoring of religious freedom conditions, we see how nations that fail to respect or protect religious freedom fall into categories. Let me mention 4. State hostility, state sponsorship, state enforcement, and state failure. State hostility involves governments actively persecuting people due to their beliefs. State sponsorship refers to the government actively promoting and sometimes even exporting ideas and propaganda, often of a violent, extremist nature, that include hostility to the religious freedom of others. State enforcement refers to the government actively applying laws and statutes such as anti-blasphemy or anti-apostasy codes to individuals, often members, of course, of religious minorities. The other case would be dissenters within the majority religion. And state failure means that the government is neglecting to take action to protect those whom others are targeting due to their beliefs. There are more than a few places in the world where governments stand idly by while thugs and terrorists and mobs abuse persecuted religious minorities. Now, sometimes the governments are so weak that there's nothing they can do. But in other places, governments could do something about it, and yet they do not prosecute, they do not intervene, the police stand aside. That's a form of persecution as well. The government is responsible for that. When they can do something about it and they don't do something about it, they're responsible, and we shouldn't pretend that they're not. And our government shouldn't pretend that they're not. When it comes to state hostility, some of these governments, like North Korea or China, are secular tyrannies. They consider all religious beliefs as potential dangers to state secularist ideologies, such as communism. I've noticed in dealing with the Chinese regime in particular, they seem to have taken very much to heart what they think the lessons are of the fall of the Soviet Union. Do not let independent institutions of civil society, especially religious ones, like the Catholic Church in Poland, flourish lest they do what the Catholic Church in Poland did, which started to unravel the entire Soviet system. The Chinese regime is very determined to not let that happen. How? Crush the institutions of civil society or control them, especially the religious ones. Other states, nations such as Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Sudan are religious tyrannies that enthrone one religion or interpretation of religion over others, which they see as rivals to the one they favor. Still others, like Russia, are a hybrid of secular and religious. In North Korea, the government severely represses religious activity, and individuals who defy it are arrested, imprisoned, tortured, or executed. Religious freedom in North Korea basically does not exist. In China, the government continues its persecution of Tibetan Buddhists and Uyghur Muslims. To stem the growth of independent Catholic and Protestant groups, lest a Poland situation develop, Beijing has arrested leaders and shut down churches. Of course, they set up their own state churches, like their own official state Catholic church. There have been reports of officials even going after registered churches, tearing down crosses and church steeples. Even the government-approved operations. If they show the slightest hint of possibly stepping out of line, bad things begin to happen. Members of Falun Gong, which as far as I can see is an exercise club, but it represents an independent institution of civil society, are deemed evil cults. An association with Falun Gong and similar organizations can cause a person to face jail terms, forced renunciations of faith, even torture in detention. In Iran, the government has executed people for the crime of waging war against God, while relentlessly targeting reformers among the Shia Muslim majority. One of the greatest Ayatollahs, you've probably not heard of him, but one of the greatest Ayatollahs in Iran is currently in jail because he does not go along with the regime's repression. He is actually a champion of religious liberty. Because of our experience, of course, we often think of Ayatollah as a bad guy, who does bad things. We think of the Ayatollah Khomeini or the Ayatollah Khamenei. But there are figures, even within the Shia majority, even leaders, even an Ayatollah, who stand up for religious freedom. And when they stand up, they wind up in prison. Of course, it's not just the Shia dissenters who are persecuted by the Iranian regime. The Sunnis are persecuted, the Sufis are persecuted, the Baha'is, the Christians. Pastor Saeed Abedini and many others remain in prison, and the regime has stirred up anti-Semitism and promoted Holocaust denial. Rouhani talks a good line. He has created this image of being a reformer. Nothing substantive has changed. I wish I could say otherwise. Sincerely, with all my heart, I do. It hasn't. To my great regret, the recent negotiations culminating in the nuclear deal with Iran did absolutely nothing to diminish oppression and the persecution of members of religious minorities and dissenting Shias in Iran. Although the Iranian regime brought up side issues and apparently gained concessions, the U.S. did not even bring up the plight of American citizens who were imprisoned by the regime for their Christian ministries or for their dissent from the regime's enforced orthodoxy. Saudi Arabia completely bans the public expression of religion other than its particular form of Islam. Not a single church or other non-Muslim house of worship exists in the entire vast peninsula, despite the large number of non-Muslims, mostly Christian, guest workers in the kingdom. That's something I didn't know about before I went on to the commission. I assumed everybody in Saudi Arabia was a Sunni Muslim. Well, there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Christian guest workers, many from the Philippines, by the way. They don't have a church. I once had this preposterous conversation with the Saudi ambassador in which I raised the issue, the ambassador from Saudi Arabia to the U.S. I said, this doesn't make any sense. You've signed on to covenants. It's one thing you're holding your own Muslim population under repression, but you have Christian guest workers in your country. They don't have a church to go to. The Catholics, mostly Filipinos, mostly Catholic. They can't go to Mass. And he said, well, you wouldn't expect the Vatican to permit a mosque in the Vatican City. I said, there are no Muslims in the Vatican City. It's a little tiny place. It's the administrative offices of the Catholic Church. This is a vast peninsula with thousands upon thousands of Filipino guest workers who just want to go to church. They don't budge. People have been picked up for having a Bible out in public. The regime claims that the Christian guest workers can have private religious ceremonies in homes. And yet when they do, we know because people from our commission have visited and talked to people off the record, When they do have religious ceremonies in homes, very often the police break in and break up the liturgy. When we complain to the Saudi government, we're told, oh, no, they shouldn't have done that. That's the local police. We're going to talk to them. And yet, it happens again and again and again. So sometimes these regimes will talk a good line. But once again, the facts on the ground are facts of repression. The Saudi regime particularly victimizes Ahmadiyya Muslims, who, though entirely peaceful, are regarded as intolerable heretics. Sudan continues its policy of Islamicization and Arabization, imposing the harshest conceivable interpretations of Sharia on Muslims and non-Muslims alike, using amputations and floggings for acts of so-called indecency, immorality, and arresting Christians for proselytizing. And finally, Russia has a formally secular government, but favors the Moscow Patriarchate of the Russian Orthodox Church while finding ways, not as severe as the other nations I've been talking about, but nevertheless finding ways of persecuting competitors such as Jehovah's Witnesses or those it deems a threat to the state, such as Muslims, often in many cases perfectly peaceful Muslims who pose no terrorism threat. Yet, terrorism or the fear of terrorism is used as a pretext for repression. Concerning state sponsorship of radical ideology, which targets others' religious freedom, Saudi Arabia continues to export its own extremist interpretation of Sunni Islam, and Iran does exactly the same thing with its extremist form of Shiism. It's not just within their borders. These are states, wealthy states, that are able to export their extremist ideology. Pakistan enforces anti-blasphemy or anti-defamation codes with religious minorities bearing the brunt of the enforcement. This includes minority Muslims, such as the Ahmadiyya, as well as members of other faiths, such as Christians and Baha'is. And finally, regarding state failure to protect religious freedom, the abysmal record of the governments of Burma, several recent governments of Egypt, the government of Iraq, Nigeria, Pakistan again, Syria, of course, exemplifies those of nations which do not protect their citizens against religious-related mob or terrorist violence. In Burma, sectarian violence and severe abuses against Christians and Muslims continues with impunity. The plight of the Rohingya Muslims, the indigenous Muslims of Burma, Myanmar, is especially alarming and heartbreaking, as countless numbers are stateless, homeless, and endangered. One way of understanding how bad the situation is for Rohingya is that you would probably rather be a Dalit, an untouchable, in India than be a Rohingya in Burma. That's how bad the situation is. Now, having said this about state failure, we need to recognize and congratulate and praise those independent people operating independently of their governments who have come to the assistance of people of other faiths. For example, last year at Christmas time, there were Egyptian Muslims who created human rings, human shields around Coptic Christian churches to prevent mobs and thugs and terrorists from attacking those churches during the Christmas season, where there have been attacks in the past very frequently. Those were just good people who decided that they did not want their co-religionists, the extremists among their co-religionists, to terrorize the Christian minority. Good for them. God bless them. And we need to know that happens. We Americans can't think that, well, the Muslims always do the bad stuff. Here was a case of Muslims putting themselves at risk, creating those human rings around the churches to protect their Christian fellow citizens. Yet in Egypt, at other times, governments have repeatedly failed to protect religious minorities, including Coptic Orthodox and other Christians, Baha'is, Shia Muslims, and dissident Sunni Muslims. In Iraq, the rise of the so-called Islamic State is a major consequence of the government's continued failure to protect the lives and freedoms of non-Muslim minorities, such as Christians and Yazidis, as well as Shia Muslims and dissenting Sunnis. In Nigeria, Boko Haram, the horrific, indescribably dreadful terrorist organization Boko Haram, attacks Christians as well as Muslims who don't go along with them. and the government continues its failure to protect innocent citizens, to prosecute perpetrators of religiously related violence that's killed more than 14,000 Nigerians, both Christian and Muslim, by the way, over the past decade or so. In Pakistan, the government's continued failure to protect Christians, Ahmadiyya, Shia, and Hindus has created a climate of impunity. It's what you get when the government doesn't do its job, resulting in further vigilante violence. And in Syria, the civil war, triggered at least in part by the Assad regime's refusal to respect human rights and embrace reform, has devolved into the horrific sectarian civil war that we all see on our television sets and read about every day. We now have a combination of state tyranny and state failure to protect life and freedom. While the Assad regime targets Sunni Muslims, its terrorist opponents, such as the Islamic State, al-Nusra, and so forth, are targeting those on all sides, from Sunni and Alawites to Christians who oppose their dictates. It is a complete nightmare. Well, as we survey the bleak landscape for religious freedom abroad, we detect a number of unmistakable patterns and trends. We see the rise of violent religious extremism, largely through radical Islamism, and its continued conflicts with the majority of Muslims, as well as with non-Muslim religious minorities. We see the continued persecution of Christians, a persecution the sheer size and scope of which is astonishing. The greatest persecutions, religious persecutions in the world, if you total them all up, the greatest victims of persecution today are Christians across the globe. And yet, the American church, the wealthy, affluent American church in all its denominations, is so little aware, seems not to care. Now, there are voices in all the denominations, there are some. There are great heroes like Frank Wolf who stand up and speak out and try to remind us, call our attention to what's going on. We should be concerned about anybody being persecuted, irrespective of their religion. But how remarkable that Christians in America seem to be so little aware of what is happening to their fellow Christians. Or maybe we just feel as though there's nothing we can do. And yet we can. Say more about that. And we see the stubborn persistence, and in some places a clear revival of anti-Semitism across countries and cultures. Let me offer a few words on these disturbing patterns and trends. It's often been said that radical Islamism and its leaders seek to recover a mythical golden age from a far distant past. While this is undoubtedly the case, we must also realize that they are also propelled by an inescapably modern and terrifying idea surfacing in the last century. That's the idea of totalitarianism. What defines totalitarianism is a series of demands, which may be summarized loosely as follows. Give fanatical leaders and movements absolute and permanent authority. Make these leaders and their followers into virtual gods, charged with seizing control of history and transforming humanity itself. It's a great recruiting tool. Release these leaders and their followers from accountability to any law or institution above themselves, any belief or custom, any moral norm or precept. Anything goes as long as you're advancing the cause. Rape, murder, prostitution, drug running. Grant these leaders and their followers complete control of every facet of human existence, from outward conduct to the innermost workings of conscience. For the better part of a century, those promoting and exploiting this malignant idea have advanced it by dressing it up in a variety of costumes and by hijacking various ideals and institutions and putting them to work in its cause. In the 1930s and 40s, this idea threatened humanity through Nazism and other forms of fascism, which exploited the concept of race and the ideology of nationalism. After World War II, totalitarianism posed its greatest threats through communism, which exploited the concepts of class and class consciousness and hijacked people's strivings for social justice, justice for workers. By the close of the 20th century, these movements had committed every crime under the sun, triggering the deaths of nearly 150 million human beings. The death toll from communism and Nazism taken together is just unbelievable. Well, just take any one of them, but certainly take communism. Tally up the Stalin and Mao Zedong death tolls, and it is almost beyond our capacity to conceive. They also waged war against the rights and duties of conscience, waged war on religion, leaving a world where, to this day, most people live in countries that are hostile, in many cases deeply hostile, to freedom of religion and belief. And today, the same totalitarian impulse that drove Nazism and communism has hijacked religion, creating contemporary radical Islamism. From the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria to the tyrannical clerics in Iran, and from al-Qaeda to the Taliban, these new totalitarians pose similar threats to the world. And they are expansionist. It's not just that they want control of this piece of property. They want to expand. Look at Iran's exportation of extremism. Look at Saudi Arabia's exportation. Look at the Islamic State. Displaying utter contempt for the rule of law and for any distinction between combatants and non-combatants in the conduct of war, they target civilians and commit mass torture and murder, precisely as the Nazis and the communists did, feeling it's completely justified because it's in our cause. Many observers presume that these movements and their leaders simply represent Islam on steroids. Some even claim that they represent the true Islam. I believe they are mistaken. Granted, the history of nearly every religion, including Islam, contains periods of despotism and bloodshed. Granted, every major religion has had to go through periods of reform and clarification of some of its beliefs and ideas. Granted, as so many Muslim reformers have stated repeatedly, Islam should be no exception. But let's be clear, no civilized religion, certainly no creed or tradition of ethical monotheism, including Islam, ever stood in principle, as the Nazis and communists did and as the Islamic State does today, for what amounts to sheer unadulterated nihilism. This is the idea that any and every means, torture, rape, prostitution, drug sales, the slaughter of innocent children, defenseless elderly people, genocide, may be carried out in the cause of hegemony and ultimately world domination. No world religion ever granted any human being, group, or government the permanent right in principle to flout any rule, break any law, commit any atrocity at will. In other words, the struggle we face is not, I think, a struggle of one religion against another, nor of religion against humanity, as some of the new atheists would say. Rather, it's a struggle that pits lawlessness and tyranny against decency and dignity. And in this struggle, reformers must be applauded for their resolute stand not only to reform and clarify from within, but to stand against the hijacking of Islam by those driven by the same impulse that drove the likes of Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, and Pol Pot. They must rip away radical Islamism's religious mask, revealing its idolatrous soul to the world. We should know not only about the radical clerics in Tehran and the corrupt regime in Saudi Arabia. We should also know about the reformers, the Ayatollah who goes to jail in Iran for standing up for religious freedom, the reformers who are in jail and in some cases have been executed in Saudi Arabia, in Pakistan. We know about the Islamic State and its radical extremism. How much do we know about the Ahmadiyya and their peaceful efforts? At the hands of violent religious extremism, Christians, especially these days Christians, face severe persecution. Ironically, it's in the Middle East, the cradle of Christianity, that both persecution and the flight of the persecuted cloud the future of the world's oldest Christian communities. Unless circumstances change and change very quickly, and perhaps they are beyond hope now, many are asking whether a graveyard will replace what was the cradle. In Egypt, violence against Coptic Christians reached alarming proportions in recent years. In Iraq, severe violence against Christians, which peaked after Saddam Hussein's fall, has returned with a vengeance. The Islamic State is principally to blame for that. Once home to approximately 1 million Christians, Iraq has considerably less than half that number today. Many Iraqi Christians sought refuge in, you guessed it, Syria, where fellow Christians and Muslims from Sunni and Shia, including Alawite, once coexisted peacefully. Well, we all know how that turned out. For Christians, Syria's civil war has been nothing short of a calamity, and today we have a massive, absolutely massive refugee crisis. And that refugee crisis has got to be on our political agenda, on our foreign policy agenda in the United States. We can help with this, and we need to go about doing it. And just outside the Middle East, in Pakistan, attacks against Christians are escalating. In September of 2013, suicide bombers launched the worst anti-Christian attack in Pakistan's history, assaulting All Saints Church in Peshawar, leaving nearly 100 dead and more than 150 other parishioners wounded. And there have been other attacks since. In looking, my friends, at the plight of Christians, especially those in the Middle East, those who know Jewish history will see something hauntingly familiar. Iraq's Jewish community provides a sobering example of what the future may well hold for Christians. Like Iraq's Christians, Iraqi Jews were there for a long time, perhaps as many as 20 centuries. As of 1947, the country's Jewish population exceeded 50,000. Today, only a handful remain. People professed shock when it was revealed in 2010 that Mohammed Morsi, who was later elected Egypt's president and then fell, depicted Jewish people as, quote, descendants of apes and pigs, whom Egyptian children and grandchildren must be taught, Morsi said, to hate down to the last generation. Yet Morsi's comments were no worse than those of Iranian leaders who deny the Holocaust, who allowed state-run media to broadcast anti-Semitic messages and hateful cartoons. Nor are they worse than the lies and defamations against Jews and Judaism that one finds in the media in Iran and elsewhere, including in Egypt. Yet it would be a mistake to say that anti-Semitism is confined to the Middle East. In post-Soviet Russia, skinhead groups commit acts of anti-Semitism in the name of Russian nationalism. In Belarus, the anti-Jewish utterances of President Alexander Lukashenko and the state media were accompanied by a failure to identify or punish the vandals of Jewish cemeteries and other property. Another case of just impunity. The thugs, the mobs desecrate the Jewish houses of worship, desecrate the cemeteries. The police look the other way. Nothing is done to stop the villains. Nobody's prosecuted. Even in Western Europe, anti-Semitism has been making a comeback. Since 2000, anti-Jewish graffiti increasingly have appeared in Paris and Berlin, Madrid and Amsterdam, Rome and even London. And synagogues have been vandalized or set ablaze in France and Sweden. In Malmö, Sweden, physical attacks fueled a Jewish exodus. In France, according to a report by the security unit of its Jewish community, there were 614 anti-Semitic incidents in 2012 compared to 389 in 2011. I don't have more recent figures, but I don't like the direction of the numbers. Who are the perpetrators of these hateful acts in Europe? Well, some are neo-Nazis. Others claim to act in the name of Islam. Compounding the problem are four factors. First, European officials remain reluctant to identify the ideological or religious motivations of perpetrators. Second, surveys show that anti-Semitic attitudes among Europe's population are shockingly widespread. Third, these surveys confirm that some of this bias manifests itself in harsh and unbalanced criticism of the State of Israel. While no nation is beyond reproach, when such criticism includes language intended to delegitimize the state itself and demonize its people and apply standards to it that no other state is held to, then we naturally suspect that its being a Jewish state has something to do with it. And finally, a number of European governments and political parties have added fuel to the fire by backing restrictions on vital religious expression, such as donning religious garb in public or the performance of kosher slaughter and male infant circumcision. This is this idea of religion belongs in private. Even the public expression of religion by wearing religious garb becomes disruptive. They proposed or enacted in some places similar kinds of restrictions on practitioners of other religions, including Christianity and Islam. France and Belgium, for example, bar students in some state schools and government workers from wearing conspicuous, so-called conspicuous religious symbols, such as the Muslim headscarf, the hijab that girls wear, or the Sikh turban, or crosses as jewelry, or the Jewish yarmulke, or the Star of David worn as a necklace around a girl's neck. Sweden, Switzerland, Norway, and Iceland have banned kosher slaughter, as well as halal slaughter. In Germany and Sweden, government authorities have told Jewish and Christian parents that they cannot homeschool their children for religious reasons. And government officials in the United Kingdom are forcing Catholic adoption agencies to shut down because they follow the moral criteria of their faith, criteria that are by no means idiosyncratically Catholic, in placing orphan children in homes that provide a mother and father and not in same-sex headed households. We've had the same thing here in the United States. where Catholic Charities has been driven out of adoption services in some jurisdictions after more than 100 years of providing good homes to orphan children. Massachusetts, Illinois, and the District of Columbia. We've got religious freedom issues here. They're not just abroad. What drives these governments and parties is an attempt to grant secularist ideology dominance in the public square by placing serious restrictions on religious expression or practice. It's an extreme view of state-church separation. We value our state-church separation, separating the institutions of the state from the institutions of the church, and we're right to. We're right to value the idea that no one should hold political authority in virtue of religious office, or that religious office should not be in the gift of political authorities. That's a good, sound separation of church and state. But according to these extremist interpretations of church and state, what you're trying to do is relegate religion to the private sphere so that the secularist ideology has hegemony, has dominance in the culture. And let me add this. This is no different in principle from attempts by theocratic forces to grant monopoly power in the public square to one particular belief over others, including ideologies such as communism that reject any and all religious beliefs. There can be secular Ayatollahs as well. Both are violations of the religious freedom ideal of a free and open marketplace of beliefs thriving in the public square. There's one more point I want to make about anti-Semitism. It's one that my dear friend, Britain's former chief rabbi, Lord Jonathan Sacks, has made. One of the ways in which hatred of Jews has endured is by expressing and justifying itself in terms of the dominant discourses of the time and place. Thus, in the medieval period, the so-called Age of Faith, anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism was expressed in theological terms, with the Jews portrayed as having been rejected by God and bearing responsibility for the death of Christ. In the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th century, when nationalism was in vogue, anti-Semitism was expressed in nationalistic terms, with Jews presented as cosmopolitan enemies of the nation, outsiders in the states in which they lived, not to be trusted as citizens. Today, when the language of human rights predominates, that's our dominant discourse, anti-Semitism is expressed by accusing Jews of violating these rights in the name of national aspirations or by the practice of male infant circumcision. So thus far I've shared with you some reflections on why religious freedom matters and why the landscape for religious freedom across the globe is so bleak. I've discussed the main kinds of violations of religious freedom with which the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has been concerned, and I've discussed the disturbing rise of violent religious extremism that nearly universally involves persecution of Christians and the stubborn resiliency of anti-Semitism. All of this leads, of course, to the question, what's being done about religious freedom abuses abroad? What is our own country doing in our foreign and diplomatic policy? Here's where the rubber meets the road. In 1988, due to the work, tireless, indefatigable work of Frank Wolf, Congress passed and President Bill Clinton signed into law the International Religious Freedom Act, which created the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and with it, an Office of Religious Freedom in the State Department, headed by a religious freedom ambassador at large. The charge was not only to monitor religious freedom overseas, but to make concrete recommendations to Congress and to the President. Most of our recommendations focus on how Washington can encourage countries to improve their religious freedom records. But Congress also gave the IRFA, the IRFA law, some real teeth through a groundbreaking enforcement mechanism. It required annual review and designation of what we call CPCs, countries of particular concern, defined as those governments who engage in systematic, ongoing, and egregious religious freedom violations. Those are the words of the statute. Systematic, ongoing, and egregious religious freedom violations. Your textbook cases are places like Iran, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Central African Republic. These nations are by definition the world's worst religious freedom abusers. Measuring each nation against the objective standards, USERF's job, the Commission's job, is to make recommendations based on its review of which countries the State Department should designate as CPCs, Once the State Department agrees on a designation, the URFA law then requires certain sanctions, or sanctions from a menu of sanctions, to kick in: diplomatic, economic, and so forth. While the law provides any administration with some flexibility in this area when it comes to selecting the particular sanctions, and the possibility of granting a waiver, the review and designation process by the administration is not discretionary. Under URFA, the law requires the review and the designations. Simply stated, the law requires every administration without fail to engage fully in the job of designating which countries are CPCs. Now, whatever one's view of appropriate penalties for violators, there can be little disagreement on the imperative of bearing witness to abuses, marking those nations. And that's what the designation process is, at a minimum, supposed to do. Unfortunately, neither Republican, let me look right at the camera, neither Republican nor Democratic administrations have consistently designated countries that meet the standard for these offenders. The result is that some of the world's worst violators, such as Pakistan and Vietnam, are escaping accountability. Pakistan is at the top of the list, our list, the Commission's list, of nations richly meriting designation as CPCs and the consequences that follow from that. And for I don't know how many years, our Commission has recommended to the State Department the designation of Pakistan as a CPC, and yet it hasn't happened. So here this evening, let me once again plead with the State Department. It's time. Designate Pakistan as a country of particular concern. And there's more. Even those countries which currently are designated as CPCs are escaping accountability on the sanctions end. Under the law, while CPC countries remain designated until removed from that status, any corresponding penalties on those nations expire after 2 years. So you have to stay at this. The law requires the administrations to stay at this. And then the waiver issue. All right, sometimes you've got to grant a waiver. Sometimes we have vital economic interests or geostrategic or military concerns that militate in favor of a waiver. But why make the waiver unconditional? And why make it indefinite? We should abandon where administrations grant the waivers, and both parties have done it. And that's fine, that's with the prerogative within the law. But let's end the practice of unconditional and unlimited waivers. They simply undermine the point of the CPC designations. In September 2013, when the current administration in Washington failed to take action, the URFA-related sanctions attached to Burma, China, Eritrea, Iran, North Korea, and Sudan expired. And while these countries are subject to sanctions under other U.S. laws, allowing the religious freedom sanctions to expire sent the disturbing message that the United States will not implement its own law on religious freedom. Clearly, it's time for the executive branch to take seriously its own URFA obligations and responsibilities by making designations and doing it in a timely manner. Its doing so can make a difference. We know this from experience. In our past experience with Vietnam, this is from before when I was on the Commission, sanctions that were imposed pursuant to a CPC designation on Vietnam caused the Vietnamese regime to significantly mitigate its religious freedom abuses. Then, acting a bit prematurely, but trying to reward Vietnam for making some progress, the administration, a different administration back then, the Bush administration, decided to lift the sanctions, lift the CPC designation and the sanctions. Well, what happened? Vietnam fell right back off the wagon, right back into its own practices. And today, we need to redesignate. It's time to redesignate Vietnam. Believe it or not, there are countries, including bad offenders like Vietnam, that care. Saudi Arabia is another one, that care about the CPC designations. They do not want to be on the list. They might not be willing to do everything you need to do to get taken off the list. They don't like being on the list. Believe me, I can tell you, I hear from their ambassadors all the time. Complaints. They're being treated unfairly. They're really not doing what we're saying they're doing, and so forth. They care. Well, if they care, let's take advantage of their caring, to keep the heat on, keep the pressure on, to protect the people in the society who are the victims of repression. When combined with diplomacy and other tools, the prospect for or reality of being designated a CPC and being sanctioned can move certain repressive governments to make changes. Now, not all. Believe me, North Korea is not doesn't care. North Korea doesn't care whether it's CPC, it doesn't care what the United States does. Now, it belongs on the CPC list. We have it on the CPC list. They're not getting a waiver anytime soon from any administration. But there are other countries where, like Vietnam, like Saudi Arabia, that do care. And in the past, we've seen that happen not only in Vietnam, but also in Turkmenistan. And let me add, having mentioned Turkmenistan, that I do commend the State Department, I'll look in the camera on this one as well, for recently designating Turkmenistan as a country of particular concern. We have been making that recommendation for a number of years, and they have now done it, and good for them. Because a CPC designation is rightly perceived as a statement by the United States about its relationship to an offending nation, it can create the political will for reform where none would otherwise exist. And it can strengthen the hand of reformers within the particular nations, thus providing what London School of Economics International Relations graduate student Rachel George calls an anchor for the promotion of human rights. Get that on the tape, too. Let me conclude by saying that for those of us who care about religious freedom, and I'm sure that's everybody at Baylor and everybody in this room, we have a job to do. Since not all of our fellow citizens are aware of what's going on, even about the persecution of their fellow Christians, and some who are aware maybe don't realize that there are things we can do, there's pressure we can bring on our own government. We can create more Frank Wolfs in the old-fashioned democratic way, rewarding politicians who will do the right thing, punishing those who don't take an interest. We need to reach out to our fellow citizens to urge them to give priority to religious freedom in carrying out their duties as citizens. We need to help our fellow citizens see the importance of caring about religious freedom both at home, where, as I say, we have some real issues. They haven't been my focus tonight. We have some real issues, and abroad. We need to explain why religious freedom matters for our country and why religious freedom abroad matters for our country. I'm not saying that religious freedom is all that matters in the design and execution of our nation's foreign and diplomatic policy. Trade considerations do matter. I get that. I have no problem with that. Of course they do. Geostrategic, geopolitical, military considerations are important. Of course they are. No one's denying that. They certainly deserve prominent places in the formation and execution of our nation's foreign policy. But religious freedom is important too. It's not a second or third class concern. It cannot be a second or third class concern for a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. By becoming vocal citizen activists for religious freedom, and I hope we'll all do that, become vocal citizen activists for religious freedom, we can move Washington to do the right thing. We must make it clear to those in public office that we expect them to honor religious freedom at home and abroad. Make it a voting issue. We must insist that religious freedom be given priority in the conduct of our national life in both domestic and international policy. Again, I thank you, Jacksons, for the honor of giving this lecture, and thank you, Baylor. Chat.
Robin, could you comment on the ambassador's role, and how the Frank Wolf amendments to Perpetrators could be helpful?
Yes. President Starr has asked about two questions here. President Starr has asked about the Ambassador for Religious Freedom, which was established by IRFA. It's an at-large ambassadorship for religious freedom, how that works, and about the legislation now pending pertaining to the reauthorization of the Commission. And that's very important, and you can all be helpful on this. The ambassadorship is important because the ambassador is the advocate for religious freedom, international religious freedom, no brief on domestic issues, is the voice for religious freedom within the administration. We are an independent agency. We do not have a seat at the table with John Kerry or Barack Obama. We're independent. We can shout into the room. The ambassador is in the room. Now, inexplicably, months and months went by with that position being vacant. While important things were happening, ISIS was emerging and developing, and the position is vacant. All right, water under the bridge. They finally appointed someone. They appointed a good man, Rabbi David Saperstein, who is now the ambassador for religious freedom, and he's within the administration, and he is the voice within the administration for religious freedom. He's also an ex officio, by virtue of his ambassadorship. He's a member of our commission. He doesn't have a vote, but he is a member of our commission. So he is the liaison back and forth between our commission and the administration. Now, as Judge Starr knows, anybody who has been in Washington knows, that's a tough position to be in because the administration wants you to be a team player. Any administration will, Republican or Democrat, they expect their ambassadors to be team players. But the point of this ambassador is to be a gadfly. He's to be an irritant. He's to be saying, no, we're not doing enough to advance religious freedom. You guys care about what the Chamber of Commerce says. You guys care about what the Joint Chiefs say. You're never paying attention to religious freedom, right? His job is to be a pain in the neck. Not easy. But we've got a good man in there. I've got a lot of faith in Rabbi Saperstein. He's got a good, established, long-term record of really standing up for international human rights. So that's good news. Now, the commission is up for reauthorization. We officially expire September 30th. There'll be something that'll be done to a continuing resolution that will extend us. But we will need long-term reauthorization. And here's where you all can help. We need your members of Congress and your senators. Down here in Texas, I'm probably not going to need you to bother your senators much because they're both going to be on the right side of this. To not only reauthorize the commission, but to reauthorize it on terms in which it is not weakened. We need to be able to play the gadfly role that we play. Now, we're never going to be, a commission like this, and no matter who my successors are, this will be my final term actually, no matter who my successors are, the job of members of this commission is to be a pain. It's like the ambassadorship. It's our job. So the administrations, Republican or Democrat, are always going to be tempted to weaken the commission, to make it less of a pain. Put it off in a corner where it can do its own thing, it can conduct studies, and not bother anybody. It's not worth having the commission. That's not why Frank Wolf created the commission. He created it to be an irritant, to be a voice for religious freedom. Look, I promise you, economic interests, I have nothing against them. I believe in the market economy, that's fine. Economic interests, the Chamber of Commerce, they're always going to have a voice in the administration. I don't care whether it's Republican, Democrat, they're going to have a voice. Their interests are going to be, they're very legitimate interests, they're going to be heard. Wall Street, you think they might have a voice? They're going to have a voice. Our military deserve an important voice. They're going to have a voice. Now the question is, will religious freedom have a voice? And that's why Frank Wolf labored and sweat, blood and tears, to establish the commission. So we need to be reauthorized, and we need to be reauthorized without any weakening. We need what, if you want a little language, urge that your representatives reauthorize the commission with a clean bill, so that we can just keep on doing the kind of work that we're doing. By the way, we're entirely bipartisan. The way the appointment structure, some members are appointed by the president, some by the leaders of the two houses of Congress. So it'll guarantee, basically what it comes down to, for the most part, it'll be 5 Republicans, 4 Democrats, with whichever party has the presidency having one more, but having 5 rather than 4. But most of what we do, because the appointments have been of people who really do care about religious freedom, most of what we do we agree on. Now we fight about some things, and they seem to be blown all out of proportion when we disagree. They seem to become more important than they are because we disagree. They're the points of disagreement. But if you actually look, for example, at the CPC designations, I think we're currently recommending 16 CPC designations. 14 of those will be unanimously agreed to. There may be 2 that we quarrel about. And legitimate quarrels where you've got borderline situations and you're not quite sure whether this government belongs on this side of the line or that side of the line. But thank you, Ken, for that question.
Last question.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for talking, Mr. George. What I was wondering is, you addressed that religious freedom is at stake throughout the world and domestically, but I was wondering if you could address why. Why are parents so afraid in every age of authentic belief?
Yeah. So the question was, look, yes, Professor George, you've taken us on a tour, you've shown us that religious freedom is in dire condition across the world, under threat, so many people being persecuted and repressed. Why? Why is that happening? And you might, if I can add to your question, why is it worse now? Because it is getting worse. Why is it worse now? Now, I addressed that a little bit. Let me use the little bit that I did say as a kind of launching pad and point of departure here. Remember when I talked about China? Repressive regimes fear civil society. That's what China's fundamental problem is. China's had an economic opening, economic liberalization. It's walking a fine line. It doesn't want to give up its iron-fisted political control. And all along there's been fear that economic liberalization might produce what a lot of people thought it would produce, including me, and I was wrong, which was political liberalization. It hasn't produced political liberalization. The Chinese look at what happened to the Soviet Union and they say, we're not going to let that happen. Now, how did it happen? Independent institutions of civil society could create allegiances among the people that provided the seedbeds for dismantling what looked like the impregnable structure of the Soviet Union. Those of us of a certain age will remember when we thought the Soviet Union would be there forever. It was like a fortress. I mean, for you youngsters, it's just history, right? It's gone. It's collapsed. We didn't see that coming. We thought it was just a question of could you contain it? We didn't dream it could be rolled back, much less destroyed. It seems so powerful. The Chinese regime looks, and they remember that, and they say it was permitting independent centers of authority, independent authority structures, what Burke called the little platoons. My friend Marianne Glendon has written so brilliantly about this. The churches, the civic associations, the Falun Gong, the exercise group, spiritual homes for people. The tyrants want all allegiance to the state, whether the state is theocratic or secularist. They want all allegiance there, and they fear what could happen if independent institutions of civil society, especially those that are connected with ideas about ultimacy, about what's ultimate and important, religious ones. The most dangerous institutions of civil society for tyrants are religious institutions. They're calling people to the highest things. Some of us will remember, again, the youngsters are too young, but will remember when Pope John Paul II returned to Poland. That was such a key moment. He returned to Poland. At that point, the fuse was lit. We didn't know it at the time. We didn't know it. But, the whole vast Soviet empire, with all its apparent impregnability, was in dire danger when the Pope went to Poland. So I think that's what they fear. The other thing that I tried to develop a little bit was partly because of modern technology, but not just modern technology. Ideology and technology are kind of interpenetrating here. You've got this spirit, this phenomenon, this mentality of totalitarianism. 20th century creation of totalitarianism. You got to control everything. No rules apply. There's nothing that the totalitarian regime for which that's off limits. There are no rules. There are no institutions. They're not answerable to anybody. anything goes. Well, that's been taken up into religious causes. That's what the Islamic State is all about. That's why they can claim to be religious people and read the Koran and everything and, rape children, cut off the heads of babies, do all these absolutely horrific, unthinkable, unconceivable things, allegedly in the name of religion. No rules apply anymore. All right? No rules of chastity, no rules of decency, no rules of respect for human life. It's all gone with this totalitarian mentality. And that is something that we have not expunged. By defeating fascism, Nazism in the Second World War, and by defeating the Soviet system, we have not destroyed the totalitarian impulse or spirit. And one thing that worries me is that even, it's not just communist secularism, and I don't want to exaggerate this. I don't want to seem or be paranoid. But it's also possible for liberal forms of secularism to get into that spirit of needing to control everything. That's the spirit that causes them to try to push religion all the way into the private sphere, where it can't influence things. So that the dominant public philosophy to which everybody's got to subscribe as citizens, unless you want to be like the Amish, is a liberal secularist ideology. That's no good. It's not right. The extreme version of state-church separation, as in French laïcité, and what some people would like for the United States, is just a caricature. It's an abuse of a true sound state-church separation, which ensures that you have a broad field of religious freedom, and ensures, as I said, that people aren't holding ecclesiastical office on the basis of political appointment or political office on the basis of ecclesiastical appointment. That's the best I can do with that one. Well, thank you so much.